3 weeks after I gave birth, I bought a $1.2 million penthouse in downtown Seattle to heal in absolute peace. On my first night there, my father called. He did not ask how I was recovering, nor did he ask if my newborn son was sleeping. He simply said, "We are moving in next week, and I do not follow rules for my grandson." Before I could process the audacity, he added that my older brother and his family were coming too. Then he delivered his final threat. "If you do not like it, get out." He thought a postpartum mother would simply surrender her own property. But he forgot what I do for a living. I did not argue. I just initiated a corporate lockdown, and when they finally barged into my lobby, they froze at who was waiting inside. Before I tell you how a family invasion turned into a federal standoff, drop a comment telling me your city and hit subscribe, because this one ends with the ultimate eviction. The rain in Seattle has a specific rhythm in late October. It is steady, relentless, and perfectly predictable. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse, holding my 3-week-old son Miles against my chest. The apartment smelled of fresh espresso and the crisp, clean ozone of a high-end air purification system. I paid a premium for this space. I paid for the square footage, the panoramic view of the Puget Sound, but most importantly, I paid for the impenetrable security. As a corporate risk actuary for a major insurance firm, my entire career revolves around anticipating disasters. I analyze probabilities, calculate the exact cost of structural failures, and build legal firewalls to protect billion-dollar assets. I spend my days identifying liabilities and neutralizing them before they can cause damage. My apartment was supposed to be the one place where I did not have to assess threats. That illusion of safety shattered when the phone on my glass coffee table vibrated. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying a single name: Harrison. I did not want to answer. I knew exactly what a phone call from my father entailed. Harrison Sterling is a man who operates a private real estate investment fund, but his true profession is bulldozing boundaries. He navigates life with the absolute certainty that the world is a series of resources placed on this earth specifically for his consumption. Growing up, I was not treated as a daughter. I was treated as his personal crisis manager. When his impulsive investments went south, I was the one who quietly restructured his debt. When my older brother Trent crashed his expensive cars, I was the one navigating the insurance claims to keep our family name out of the local papers. They demanded my utility, but they despised my independence. I shifted Miles gently to my other shoulder, ensuring his small head was supported, and swiped the screen to accept the call. I did not offer a warm greeting. With Harrison, pleasantries are merely an invitation for him to talk over you. "Sloane," he barked. His voice carried that familiar booming resonance designed to occupy all the oxygen in a room. "We are moving in next week." I kept my breathing perfectly even. I looked down at my son, who was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the chaos trying to transmit itself through the phone speaker. "Moving in," I repeated. My voice was flat, carrying zero emotional inflection. "Yes, moving in." Harrison continued, his tone thick with unearned authority. "You just had a baby. You are a single mother now, and you need supervision. I have already packed my winter coats, and I am bringing Trent and Jasmine with me. Their current lease situation is a mess, and it makes total financial sense to consolidate resources. You have 4 bedrooms in that massive new place of yours. It is completely selfish for you to hoard all that space." I was talking about the nursery I spent months designing. He was talking about my specialized home office where I handle highly classified corporate risk data. He was talking about a $1.2 million asset I purchased with my own money to ensure my child would never have to flinch at a raised voice. "Dad, this is a highly secure residential building," I replied, keeping my tone as clinical as a balance sheet. "You cannot simply move 3 adults into my home without my consent." "It is not up for discussion," Harrison snapped. The synthetic paternal concern evaporated, replaced by the cold steel of a dictator who has just been questioned. "We are coming. I am your father, and I do not follow rules for my grandson. If you do not like it, get out." He did not wait for my response. The line went dead. A typical daughter might have burst into tears. A different sister might have frantically texted Trent to beg for an explanation. But my profession trains me to view human behavior through the lens of liability management. Harrison had just submitted an unauthorized request to override my life. He assumed that because he held the biological title of father, he possessed administrative privileges over my property. They looked at a vulnerable postpartum mother and saw weakness. They looked at my luxury penthouse and saw a free vacation home. But I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. In the risk assessment industry, we categorize threats by severity. A minor inconvenience is a level 1. What Harrison just proposed was a level 4 liability, a catastrophic systemic breach. You do not negotiate with a level 4 liability. You isolate it and you neutralize it with extreme prejudice. I whispered to Miles, promising him that no one was getting through our door. I did not call Harrison back to argue. Arguing requires handing over your emotional leverage, and it signals to a narcissist that their manipulation is working. Instead, I placed my son gently into his automated bassinet. I walked over to the kitchen island, opened my laptop, and began the meticulous work of locking my family out of my life permanently. For my entire life, Harrison used noise as his primary weapon. In our household, volume equaled authority. If he made a bad investment, he would scream at the market. If someone questioned his judgment, he would raise his voice until the sheer acoustic pressure forced them into submission. He engineered chaos because chaos requires a cleaner, and that was my designated role in the family ecosystem. I was not treated as a daughter. I was their personal financial garbage collector. Whenever his private real estate fund faced a liquidity crisis because of his reckless spending, I was the one who quietly restructured his debt. When my older brother Trent crashed his expensive cars or defaulted on his luxury apartment leases, Harrison would use his booming voice to intimidate the landlords while I silently navigated the insurance claims and paid the penalties to keep our family name out of the public record. They demanded my utility, but they despised my independence. They saw my ability to organize data and anticipate problems as a free service designed to make their lives smoother. They never respected the intellect behind the labor. To them, my boundaries were just suggestions they had not yet found a way to overwrite. Harrison assumed my silence during these cleanups was submission. He did not understand that I was not submitting. I was simply auditing the damage and learning every single vulnerability in his financial architecture. I spent my 20s absorbing their toxic debt and shielding them from the consequences of their own arrogance. I bought my penthouse to permanently resign from that position. I looked down at Miles, ensuring his sleep remained undisturbed by the memory of my father's voice, and promised myself that the era of cleaning up their messes was officially over. I did not cry. A younger version of myself might have panicked, shedding tears of frustration, or frantically searching for a way to appease him. I did not argue either. Engaging in a shouting match with Harrison is exactly what he desires. Arguing validates his authority and provides him with the emotional friction he uses to fuel his massive ego. He expected me to beg. He expected me to surrender my sanctuary just to keep the peace. I simply waited for him to take a breath. "Have a good flight, Dad," I said. I tapped the red button on my screen and ended the call. I did not say it out of politeness. I said it to permanently seal the interaction. I set the device face down on the cold glass coffee table. In the corporate risk sector, we classify threats on a highly specific scale. A minor operational glitch is a level 1. A localized data leak is a level 2. Sitting in the pristine quiet of my living room, I realized Harrison Sterling was no longer my father. I was a level 4 liability. A level 4 liability is a catastrophic systemic threat, a hostile force that possesses the potential to dismantle the entire foundation of an enterprise. You do not try to fix a level 4 threat. You do not negotiate with it. You certainly do not invite it inside your secure perimeter. You quarantine it. You build an absolute unyielding firewall, and you let the threat destroy itself against your defenses. I looked down at Miles, perfectly safe in my arms. The quarantine protocol had officially begun. Exactly 5 minutes after I terminated the call with Harrison, the tranquility of my living room was breached a second time. My phone, still resting face down on the glass coffee table, vibrated with a sharp, sustained buzz. It was not a text message or a standard email notification. The screen illuminated the dim room with a bright red banner. It was a high-priority security alert, generated by the residential management application that controls my building. The notification was brief, clinical, and completely unambiguous. Warning: multiple failed login attempts detected on the resident portal. In the corporate risk sector, we refer to this as a brute force attack. It is the digital equivalent of an intruder violently rattling a doorknob to see if the internal mechanism gives way. I did not panic. I simply picked up the phone, bypassed the standard interface, and opened the raw security logs to read the back-end data. The information was crystal clear. Someone was actively trying to access the Homeowners Association digital gateway using my personal credentials. I checked the source details. The Internet Protocol address pinged directly back to Harrison's private office network. He was not just packing his winter coats and preparing for a flight to Seattle. He was actively launching a digital intrusion to establish his authority before his plane even left the runway. I looked at the password string he was attempting to use. It was an old, compromised phrase we had shared for a family cloud storage account over 7 years ago. He actually believed he could bypass $1 million security infrastructure using a relic from my teenage years. I knew exactly what he was trying to achieve. The Homeowners Association portal for my building does not just handle maintenance requests and amenity bookings. It controls the primary access matrix for the entire property. If Harrison successfully breached my account, he could navigate directly to the security tab and manually add his own name to the permanent guest registry. Achieving permanent guest status in this building is a golden ticket. It would automatically generate a digital key code for the lobby and grant him unescorted elevator access directly to my penthouse floor. I was trying to digitize his invasion. He wanted to ensure that when he arrived in Seattle, he would not have to wait in the cold rain or ask the concierge to call up to my unit for permission. He intended to simply walk through the polished marble lobby, flash his newly minted digital clearance, and open my front door as if he owned the entire building. He was attempting a classic supply chain attack, aiming to compromise a trusted third-party system to bypass my personal defenses. The audacity was staggering, but my pulse did not elevate by a single beat. I watched the high-resolution screen as a fourth and then a fifth failed login attempt registered in real time. He was impatient. He was furious that the digital door was not immediately swinging open to accommodate his demands. For a brief moment, I could perfectly visualize him sitting behind his heavy mahogany desk, his face turning a mottled red with frustration as he hammered his thick fingers against his keyboard, unable to comprehend why his usual tactics were failing. I did not send him a text message demanding that he stop. I did not call him back to warn him that I was monitoring his digital footprints. You do not warn a hostile virus that you are installing antivirus software. You simply execute the quarantine protocol. I accessed the master control panel of my network and began the lockdown. First, I blacklisted his Internet Protocol address at the firewall level. I watched with quiet satisfaction as the security alerts instantly vanished from my monitor. His network could no longer even ping my residential server. Next, I logged into the building portal using my heavily encrypted biometric authentication. I purged all secondary access codes and instituted a strict manual override policy. I sent a direct flagged message to the head of building security, officially stating that under no circumstances was anyone named Harrison Sterling to be granted entry, regardless of what claims or documentation he might present. I looked down at Miles, who was still sleeping peacefully against my chest, his tiny hands curled into fists. The physical world around us remained perfectly silent, smelling only of fresh espresso and clean rain. Harrison thought he was orchestrating a seamless home invasion. He assumed I was a frightened, exhausted single mother, cowering in my living room, paralyzed by the booming resonance of his voice. He had no idea he was dealing with an access architect who treated family toxicity as a severe corporate liability. The digital gateway was officially sealed. He had failed to hack his way into my life, which meant he would inevitably try to use the law to force his way inside. Securing the digital perimeter was only the first step. I knew how Harrison operated. When digital doors close, he relies on analog manipulation and legal loopholes to force his way inside. I was not going to give him the opportunity to weaponize our biology. I picked up my phone and dialed my corporate real estate attorney. This penthouse was not just a home. It was a $1.2 million asset located in a state where tenant protection laws are notoriously rigid. If my father somehow managed to cross my threshold and drop his bags in my guest room, removing him would become a grueling legal nightmare. The local police would arrive, see a grandfather claiming he had permission to stay, shrug their shoulders, and declare it a civil family dispute. I would be trapped in a prolonged eviction process while he consumed my sanctuary and disrupted my newborn son. I refused to let my peace of mind rest on a gray area of the law. I instructed my attorney to execute an immediate title transfer. Using the expedited electronic filing system, we moved the deed of the penthouse from my personal name directly into a newly formed irrevocable trust. In the world of corporate risk management, an irrevocable trust is the ultimate defensive shield. Once the paperwork is filed, the transfer is permanent and absolute. It completely severed my public ownership of the property. This maneuver fundamentally changed the battlefield. The apartment was no longer a family residence owned by a daughter. It was a heavily protected asset owned by a faceless legal entity. An irrevocable trust does not have a father. It does not have an older brother, and it certainly does not care about fabricated familial obligations or holiday guilt trips. It operates strictly on documented bylaws and fiduciary duties. To reinforce the perimeter, we drafted a mandatory operating clause explicitly stating that the property could not be occupied, shared, or utilized by any non-beneficiary without prior notarized corporate approval. If Harrison arrived and tried to claim a biological right to sleep in my home, he would not be arguing with an exhausted single mother. He would be fighting a corporate entity. He would be attempting to illegally occupy commercial property, transforming his arrogant family visit into a direct act of criminal trespassing. I watched the encrypted confirmation receipt hit my inbox. The legal firewall was now cast in iron. My father thought he could use his booming voice to demand a bedroom, completely unaware that he was preparing to trespass against a corporate fortress. Later that afternoon, the rhythmic drumming of the Seattle rain continued against the glass. I secured Miles in his baby carrier against my chest and took the private elevator down to the lobby. I needed a mundane task to clear my head, and checking the physical mail seemed entirely harmless. The lobby of my building is a fortress of polished marble and hushed tones. The concierge greeted me with a polite nod as I approached the secure mailroom. I unlocked my brass mailbox and pulled out a small stack of envelopes. Most of it was standard junk mail, local restaurant menus, a water bill in the name of the newly formed trust, and a few glossy catalogs. But near the bottom of the pile, a thick white envelope caught my eye. The paper was heavy and textured. It was the distinct type of stationery that premium financial institutions use for their exclusive clients. I slid it out from under a furniture catalog, and my eyes landed on the transparent recipient window. The air in my lungs suddenly turned to ice. The address printed on the front was mine. It listed my street, my building name, my exact penthouse unit number, and my zip code. But the names printed in bold black ink right above my address did not belong to me. The envelope was addressed to Trent Sterling and Jasmine Sterling. My brother and my sister-in-law had never lived in Washington State. They had never paid a single utility bill in Seattle, nor had they ever set foot inside this building. Yet here was a piece of premium financial correspondence sitting in my hand, claiming my sanctuary as their primary residence. I felt a strange, hyper-focused calm settle over my nervous system. I slid my finger along the top edge of the envelope and opened it. Technically, opening mail addressed to someone else is a federal offense, but when hostile actors weaponize your physical address, the rules of polite society completely evaporate. Inside was a brand new platinum credit card issued by a major national bank. The heavy metal card was irrelevant. The only detail that mattered was the billing address printed at the top right corner of the statement. My unit number, my zip code. The nature of the conflict shifted instantly. This was no longer just an arrogant father demanding a free place to sleep. This was a calculated predatory legal maneuver. I live in a state where tenant rights and squatter protections are fiercely guarded by the law. The legal system is designed to prevent vulnerable people from facing sudden homelessness. If a person can prove they reside at an address, even without a formal lease agreement, they gain immediate legal protections against eviction. Receiving official financial mail at a location is the absolute gold standard for establishing that paper trail. If Trent and Jasmine successfully collected this mail and managed to bring their suitcases across my threshold, they would cease to be unwelcome guests. They would become legal tenants in the eyes of the state of Washington. If I called the police to remove them, the officers would look at this platinum credit card statement, shrug their shoulders, and declare it a civil matter. I would have to take my own family to housing court. I would lose tens of thousands in legal fees while they occupied my home, dismantled my peace, and forced my newborn son to live in a hostile environment. They were not coming for a chaotic family visit. They were executing a coordinated supply chain attack on my property rights. My digital firewall was impenetrable, but the analog invasion had already breached the perimeter. And based on my risk assessment, the threat was escalating faster than I had anticipated. They were not coming to Seattle to see my newborn son. They were not planning a chaotic but temporary family vacation. They were meticulously manufacturing a legal paper trail. In the state of Washington, tenant protection laws are incredibly robust. They are designed to shield vulnerable people from sudden displacement, but in the hands of malicious actors, they become a highly effective weapon. By routing premium financial correspondence to my exact address, Trent and Jasmine were establishing a documented history of residency before their flight even landed. I saw the entire architecture of their scheme crystallize in my mind. They knew exactly what they were doing. If they managed to cross my threshold and drop their luggage inside my guest room, that single piece of mail would act as an impenetrable shield. If I called the authorities to physically remove them, the responding officers would look at the credit card statement, shrug, and declare the situation a civil dispute. The police would be completely powerless to evict them. I would be forced to navigate a grueling months-long legal battle in housing court just to reclaim my own space, bleeding thousands of dollars in attorney fees while they lived rent-free down the hall from my baby. My own family was trying to trap me in a legal loophole, exploiting my sanctuary for their own financial gain. If they made it past my front door, I would not be able to force them out. The threat was no longer a theoretical annoyance. It was an active, coordinated legal ambush. The analog perimeter had been breached, and they were already moving in for the kill. I stood in the hushed quiet of the mailroom, holding the premium envelope between my fingers. A normal person might have ripped it to shreds in a sudden fit of rage, furious at the sheer audacity of the intrusion. A younger version of myself might have thrown it in the lobby trash can, desperately hoping the problem would just disappear. I did neither. In my line of work, destroying fraudulent documentation is the equivalent of setting fire to your own shield. Evidence is not something you discard. Evidence is a weapon you carefully catalog and prepare to deploy. I carried the envelope back up the private elevator to my penthouse. The moment the steel doors of my unit clicked shut, I went straight to the kitchen island. I placed the envelope flat on the pristine marble surface right next to my glowing laptop monitor. I pulled out my phone and activated the high-resolution camera. I photographed the front of the envelope, ensuring the printed names of Trent and Jasmine Sterling, hovering right above my exact unit number, were perfectly in focus. I captured the postmark, the transparent recipient window, and the physical condition of the mail. I opened the encrypted audit folder I had created earlier that morning. I uploaded the images directly into a new subdirectory labeled Mail Fraud Evidence. I placed these high-resolution photos right next to the server logs and Internet Protocol addresses I had exported from Harrison's failed attempt to breach the building portal. I was building an airtight, undeniable timeline. A digital break-in attempt followed immediately by a coordinated physical mail fraud. Next, I opened a secure browser and navigated to the official portal for the United States Postal Inspection Service. Federal law takes mail manipulation incredibly seriously, and I intended to utilize the full weight of that federal authority. I filled out a comprehensive fraud report. I attached the photographs and wrote a concise clinical description of the incident. I stated clearly that two individuals who do not reside at my property were attempting to establish fraudulent tenancy by manipulating financial billing records. I hit submit and saved the official confirmation receipt directly to my encrypted hard drive. The federal government was now quietly aware of my family's actions. Reporting the crime was my digital defense. Now I needed to execute the physical rejection. I walked over to my home office and retrieved a thick red permanent marker from my desk drawer. I returned to the kitchen and drew a heavy diagonal line straight across the front of the pristine white envelope. In stark block letters, I wrote "Return to sender, not at this address, fraudulent claim." I felt a sharp, cold sense of satisfaction as the bright red ink soaked into the premium paper, permanently defacing their trap. As I stared at the red ink, a memory surfaced. When I was 20 years old, Trent used my Social Security number to secure a loan for a luxury sports car. When I discovered the identity theft and confronted him, Harrison cornered me in our living room. He used his booming voice to demand my silence. He told me that pressing charges would ruin my brother's life and that as a family, we protect our own. He demanded I absorb the financial hit. I spent 3 years of my early 20s destroying my own credit and working overtime to pay off a car I never even drove, all because I was too terrified to defy my father. They expected me to be that same terrified 20-year-old girl. They thought I would look at this credit card statement, swallow my panic, and quietly absorb their fraud to avoid a confrontation. They thought the old rules still applied. I looked over at Miles sleeping softly in his mechanical swing. I had promised him a life completely free from their toxic chaos. I picked up the defaced envelope, walked out of my apartment, and took the elevator straight back down to the lobby. I bypassed the concierge and handed the envelope directly to the postal carrier who was just finishing his route. I ensured he manually scanned it and logged it as undeliverable. Trent and Jasmine were never going to receive their platinum card. The bank would register the returned mail and immediately flag their new account for a critical address discrepancy. Their analog paper trail had just hit a federal dead end. They thought they had secured a legal foothold in my home, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just quietly severed their only lifeline. As I stared at the bold red ink soaking into the premium paper, a very specific memory surfaced. This was not the first time Trent had treated my identity as a public utility. When I was in college, carefully trying to build my own financial independence, my brother stole my Social Security number to secure a high-interest loan for a luxury sports car. When the bank notices arrived and I uncovered the blatant identity theft, I went straight to our father expecting justice. But Harrison did not reprimand his son. Instead, he cornered me in the living room. He used his towering physical presence and his booming voice to force my compliance. He demanded I keep my mouth shut. He told me that reporting the crime would ruin Trent's future and that a good daughter sacrifices for the sake of the family. He forced me to quietly absorb the massive financial damage, actively protecting the predator while punishing the victim. I spent the rest of my early 20s working grueling hours to fix the credit wreckage they left behind entirely alone. I turned away from the kitchen island and looked over at my newborn son Miles, sleeping softly in the quiet room. A fierce, protective clarity washed over me. I made a silent, unbreakable vow right then and there. I would never allow my son to inherit that toxic legacy. He would never be forced to shrink himself to accommodate an arrogant man, and he would never be taught to set his own life on fire just to keep my relatives warm. The generational cycle of complicity ended the exact moment I became a mother. The physical male was not the only vector of their attack. Just as I secured the baby in his swing, my phone began vibrating across the kitchen island with a frantic, stuttering rhythm. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of text messages from Jasmine. My sister-in-law operates entirely on the currency of public perception. She has spent the last 5 years cultivating a massive following as a lifestyle influencer, projecting an image of effortless luxury that I happen to know is financed entirely by high-interest credit cards. I opened the message thread. There was no greeting. She simply sent a hyperlinked web address followed by a string of celebratory emojis. The text below the link read, "Our new aesthetic is finally here." I tapped the link. It routed me directly to a social media platform where a video was already accumulating hundreds of thousands of views. The video began with Jasmine sitting in what looked like a rented staging room, speaking directly to her massive audience. She clasped her hands together and announced with breathless excitement that the Sterling family was officially expanding their creative footprint. She told her followers they were relocating to a breathtaking new creative studio in downtown Seattle. The screen transitioned to a slideshow. My jaw locked. Jasmine was displaying high-resolution photographs of my penthouse. She had gone online, found the original luxury real estate listing from when I purchased the property, and downloaded the architectural photos to pass them off as her own. She narrated over the images, claiming the expansive living room would be perfect for hosting brand collaborations. Then the slideshow shifted to the nursery. It was the room I had meticulously designed for Miles, featuring non-toxic sage green paint and a custom reclaimed cedar accent wall. Jasmine spoke with a voice that dripped with casual entitlement. She told her 500,000 followers that this specific room possessed the absolute best natural daylight in the entire unit, so she and Trent had officially claimed it as her dedicated live stream studio. She casually mentioned that they would just push the baby furniture into the small laundry closet down the hall because a newborn does not really need a view. She was publicly erasing my motherhood for the sake of her digital content. She was promising 500,000 strangers a tour of a home she had absolutely no legal right to enter. A typical sister-in-law might have sent a furious text message demanding she delete the post. But I do not engage in petty internet arguments. I treat social media the exact same way I treat corporate data leaks. I opened a secure browser and navigated directly to the legal copyright infringement portal of the platform. I uploaded the original property deed and the digital watermarks proving I was the sole legal owner of the images and the physical space. I filed a formal Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown notice citing unauthorized commercial use of private property. I did not stop there. I instructed my corporate attorney to draft a formal cease and desist order. The document explicitly demanded that Jasmine Sterling immediately retract her false statements regarding her residency and cease using my property to fraudulently secure brand sponsorships. We sent the digital document directly to the professional email address managed by her talent agency. I watched the video buffer and then suddenly go dark as the platform algorithm registered the severe copyright strike. The screen displayed a gray error box stating the content was removed. I did not text her to gloat. I let the silence do the talking. The digital illusion she was selling to her followers had just been completely dismantled by a corporate legal protocol. I took a slow sip of my water, confident that the perimeter was secure. But arrogant people rarely check the locks before they try to kick down the door. I did not waste a single keystroke drafting an angry text message. I did not call my brother to demand that he control his wife. Engaging in a digital shouting match with an internet personality is a fundamentally flawed strategy. It only provides them with the attention they crave and the screenshots they need to fuel their victim narrative. Instead of fighting her in the comment section, I bypassed her entirely and targeted the infrastructure of her platform. I opened a secure browser and navigated directly to the legal copyright infringement portal for the social media application. Using my corporate credentials, I initiated a formal Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown protocol. I uploaded the original property deed, the digital watermarks from the architectural photographer, and the legal purchase agreement proving I held the sole commercial rights to every image she had stolen. I categorized her video as a fraudulent commercial exploitation of private residential property. But severing the video from the internet was not enough to neutralize the liability. Jasmine operated through a talent management agency that negotiated her brand deals and sponsorships. If you want to stop a malicious actor, you do not politely ask them to leave. You cut off their revenue stream. I contacted my corporate attorney and instructed him to draft a heavy-handed cease and desist order. We did not send this order to Jasmine. We bypassed her and sent the digital document directly to the primary email address of her management team. The legal notice explicitly stated that their client was using stolen corporate assets to fraudulently secure brand sponsorships. It made it absolutely clear that any further claims regarding my Seattle penthouse would result in immediate litigation against the agency itself for facilitating fraud. I watched the delivery confirmation appear on my screen. I knew the exact moment the legal threat landed on her manager's desk. I did not need to raise my voice or hurl insults. I simply watched as the digital illusion she was selling to her audience was systematically dismantled by the cold, unforgiving reality of corporate law. I had just closed the legal portal confident that the digital perimeter was secure. The plan they communicated explicitly stated they were arriving next Tuesday. I had allocated 5 full days to finalize my physical defense protocols. But in the world of corporate risk management, you quickly learn that hostile actors rarely adhere to a polite schedule. Malicious threats do not respect your timeline. They rely on the element of surprise to bypass your logic and trigger a panic response. The silence of my penthouse was suddenly shattered by a harsh, pulsating chime. It was not the gentle notification of an email. It was a Tier 1 security alert originating directly from the primary lobby surveillance system. A glowing red banner flashed across my central monitor. I leaned forward and tapped the screen to access the live feed. The high-definition camera displayed the expansive marble lobby of my building. The visual was incredibly jarring. Standing right in the center of the pristine, quiet space was my entire family. They had arrived 5 days early. It was a calculated ambush. They assumed that by showing up unannounced, they would catch me sleep-deprived, overwhelmed, and completely unable to mount a defense. They expected me to simply fold under the sudden pressure of their physical presence and let them push their way inside. Through the thick glass doors of the lobby, I could see a massive moving truck parked illegally in the loading zone. They had not packed for a brief family visit. They had packed their entire lives into that truck, fully intending to unload it into my sanctuary. Trent was standing near the revolving doors, looking nervous and clutching a heavy cardboard box to his chest. Jasmine stood a few feet away, furiously tapping on her smartphone, likely trying to figure out why her social media account was suddenly restricted. But my focus immediately locked onto my father. Harrison was positioned squarely in front of the concierge desk. He was wearing his heavy wool coat, his chest puffed out in a posture of total dominance. I watched his body language on the silent feed. He was gesturing wildly, leaning over the marble counter to intimidate the young security guard on duty. He was employing his classic strategy of using sheer physical mass and volume to steamroll a lower-level employee into compliance. Before I could even process the full scope of their early arrival, the internal intercom on my kitchen wall buzzed. It was a direct line from the front desk. I walked over and pressed the audio button. "Miss Sterling," the concierge said, his voice trembling slightly over the speaker. "I am so sorry to disturb you. There is a man down here named Harrison. He claims to be your father. He says he is the primary financial backer of your unit, and he is demanding that I issue 3 master key cards for his moving crew immediately. He is getting very aggressive." The ambush was fully underway. They were standing at the final gate, aggressively trying to socially engineer their way past the only physical barrier left between my peaceful life and their toxic chaos. The timeline was broken, but my firewall was not. I did not panic. I simply instructed the concierge to step away from the desk because I was coming down to handle the liability myself. The internal intercom mounted on my kitchen wall buzzed a second time, louder and more insistent than before. I pressed the audio receiver. The voice of the young concierge echoed through the speaker, tight with genuine panic. He informed me that the man claiming to be my father was now actively escalating the situation. Harrison was standing in the center of the lobby, shouting at the top of his lungs, slamming his heavy fist against the marble front desk, and demanding immediate access to a master key card. He was using his classic intimidation tactics, relying on sheer volume and physical aggression to force a lower-level employee into committing a severe security breach. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I spoke into the intercom with absolute freezing clarity. I told the concierge to step exactly 3 feet away from the counter and to keep his hands visible. I instructed him to verbally inform the aggressive individual that the building operates under strict private security protocols and that building management would dispatch the local police department in exactly 2 minutes if he did not immediately cease hostilities. I explicitly ordered the concierge that under no circumstances was he to issue a physical or digital key. I released the intercom button, and the kitchen fell silent again. The digital defense phase was officially over. It was time for a physical confrontation. I walked into the nursery and checked the secure camera feed. Miles was still sleeping peacefully in his mechanized swing, completely insulated from the toxic chaos unfolding 30 floors below us. I stepped out of my apartment and locked the heavy steel deadbolt of my penthouse door behind me, ensuring the perimeter was sealed. I walked into the private elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the steel doors closed and the car began to descend, I did not feel the familiar suffocating fear that my father used to instill in me. I felt nothing but the cold mechanical precision of an actuary preparing to liquidate a bad asset. Harrison assumed he could bully his way into my life. He was about to discover that I was no longer his terrified daughter. I was the architect of this fortress, and his eviction was about to be executed permanently. I stepped away from the kitchen intercom. The digital firewall had held, but the physical confrontation was now completely unavoidable. I walked back down the hallway to the nursery. Miles was still sleeping peacefully in his mechanized swing, completely unaware of the hostility attempting to breach our walls. I stepped backward out of the room and pulled the heavy solid core door shut. I engaged the physical deadbolt, then entered a 4-digit code into the secondary keypad installed on the doorframe. My son was now secured inside an impenetrable vault, completely isolated from whatever was about to happen downstairs. I did not spend time practicing what I was going to say. Emotional arguments are entirely useless against people who thrive on chaos. Instead, I walked into my home office and approached my fireproof safe. I unlocked it and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside this folder was the physical architecture of my defense. It contained the notarized property deed, proving the penthouse was owned by an anonymous corporate trust. It held the confirmation receipt from the federal postal inspector regarding the mail fraud. It contained a printed copy of the active cease and desist order we had just served to my sister-in-law. And finally, it held a highlighted copy of the building security bylaws regarding trespassing and police intervention. I held the manila folder firmly in my hand. It was the only weapon I needed. I walked out of my penthouse and double-locked the main entryway. I stepped into the private express elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet, brightly lit cabin. As the elevator began its rapid descent, the digital display above the door ticked backward, 30, 25, 20. The mechanical hum of the descent was the only sound. With every floor we passed, I systematically shut down any lingering biological instinct to defer to the man who raised me. I compartmentalized the decades of manipulation and locked them away. I was no longer a daughter walking down to greet her family. I was a corporate risk actuary descending to mitigate a severe liability. By the time the digital display flashed the word lobby, my heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute. The steel doors slid open. The bright lights of the marble foyer poured into the cabin. I stepped out onto the polished floor, gripping the manila folder, completely prepared to liquidate the threat. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid open to reveal a scene of manufactured chaos. The typically serene marble lobby of my building had been completely transformed into a circus of liability. Trent was sweating near the revolving doors, awkwardly balancing 3 heavy cardboard boxes stacked against his chest. He was already treating the luxury foyer like a cheap loading dock, completely ignoring the confused stares from the residents passing by. To his left, Jasmine had managed to bypass her previous platform restriction by launching a live broadcast from an alternate account. She was holding her smartphone on a stabilized mount, actively weeping into the camera lens. I stood at a distance and watched her perfectly execute a performance of engineered victimhood. She was broadcasting to a live audience that she was being maliciously locked out onto the street. She wiped away a theatrical tear and claimed she was a black woman actively facing targeted housing discrimination, orchestrated by her own vicious sister-in-law. She was deliberately weaponizing a very real societal issue to generate public outrage and force a physical security breach. But the loudest and most dangerous element in the room was my father. Harrison was standing directly over the main concierge desk, aggressively cornering the senior property manager. He was deploying his booming baritone voice like a physical weapon, a tactic designed to overwhelm the central nervous system of anyone in its path. He slammed his hand flat against the marble counter and loudly declared to the entire lobby that he was the primary financial backer of my penthouse. He demanded immediate keycard access for his moving crew bedding entirely on the assumption that the property manager would simply hand over the keys to avoid a messy public spectacle. I stood quietly at the edge of the elevator bank, gripping my manila folder. A younger version of myself would have sprinted across the lobby, desperately begging him to lower his voice and stop causing a scene. But I did not move. I did not interrupt his performance. I simply observed the variables in play and let him finish digging his legal grave in front of multiple high-definition security cameras. I stepped out from the shadow of the elevator alcove and walked deliberately toward the center of the lobby. The sharp click of my heels against the polished marble floor echoed through the cavernous space, cutting straight through my father's booming voice. Harrison had undoubtedly been painting a very specific picture for the property manager. He was selling a carefully crafted narrative of a desperate, overwhelmed, and exhausted single mother who desperately needed her patriarch to step in and manage her life. He needed the building staff to view me as a fragile, incompetent liability so he could justify his aggressive intervention. But as I stepped into the bright overhead lights, that entire narrative instantly disintegrated. I did not look like a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I was not wearing stained sweatpants, and I did not look sleep-deprived. I was wearing a tailored charcoal gray silk blouse and perfectly structured trousers. My posture was entirely rigid, and my expression was completely devoid of emotion. I looked exactly like what I am, a senior corporate actuary fully prepared to dismantle a hostile negotiation. The property manager looked past my father's wide shoulders and saw me approaching. The immediate relief on his face was palpable. He knew I was not a helpless victim. He knew I was the anonymous beneficiary of the corporate trust that owned the most expensive unit in his building, and he knew I did not tolerate security breaches. Harrison finally realized he had lost the manager's attention. He stopped shouting and turned around to face me. His face was flushed red from his own manufactured rage, and his eyes widened for a fraction of a second when he processed my appearance. He expected to find a terrified girl he could easily steamroll. Instead, he found a fortified wall. He opened his mouth to speak, fully prepared to redirect his aggressive volume directly at me. But before he could utter a single syllable, I raised my hand in a sharp, crisp motion demanding absolute silence. Harrison stared at my raised hand for a fraction of a second before his expression completely shifted. He realized that the property manager was no longer a viable asset to manipulate. The social engineering tactic had failed, so he immediately pivoted to his ultimate contingency plan. He reached into his heavy wool coat pocket, pulled out his smartphone, and dialed 911. I watched in absolute clinical fascination as his entire physical demeanor transformed right in front of me. The aggressive, towering patriarch vanished in an instant. In his place stood a terrified, desperate grandfather. He held the phone to his ear and began to speak with a perfectly engineered tremor in his voice. He told the emergency dispatcher that he was the legal owner of the penthouse upstairs and that his daughter was currently experiencing a severe and violent episode of postpartum psychosis right here in the building lobby. He fed the emergency operator a series of highly calculated and incredibly dangerous lies. He claimed that I was completely detached from reality, that I was screaming at the walls, and most crucially, that I had locked his helpless newborn grandson alone inside the apartment. He practically wept into the receiver, begging the police to dispatch armed officers immediately to break down the door and save the child. It was a masterful deployment of a highly destructive tactic. He was actively weaponizing the local police department against me. By claiming a severe maternal mental health crisis and an endangered infant, he was attempting to bypass all standard eviction laws and trigger an emergency forced entry protocol. He knew that if the police believed a baby was in imminent physical danger, they would not wait for a court order or property management approval to breach my front door. They would simply smash it off the hinges, granting him the physical access he needed under the guise of a rescue mission. A normal mother might have lunged at him. She might have screamed at the top of her lungs to tell the dispatcher he was lying panicking at the thought of law enforcement rushing into her home. But panic is a completely useless metric in a crisis. I stood perfectly still on the marble floor, my breathing steady and completely controlled. I did not interrupt his performance on the phone. I did not break my rigid posture. I simply tightened my grip on the manila folder in my hand. He thought he was calling in a tactical strike force to completely dismantle my defenses. He had absolutely no idea that he had just invited law enforcement to a heavily surveilled location to witness his own legal destruction. I had every single piece of documentation required to instantly prove he was filing a false police report and attempting a fraudulent entry. He was not cornering me. He was just handing me the exact authority I needed to have him permanently removed from the premises. I stood perfectly still on the polished marble floor and crossed my arms over my chest. I watched the man who raised me execute his theatrical performance with the detached curiosity of an auditor observing a predictable fraud. He was pouring every ounce of his energy into the desperate grandfather routine, begging the emergency dispatcher to save my son from my imaginary psychotic break. He truly believed he was executing a flawless checkmate. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking blindfolded into a heavily monitored legal trap. Long before I stepped into the elevator to confront them, I had established a secure line of communication. Pinned discreetly behind the sharp lapel of my charcoal silk blouse was a microtransmitter. It was a standard piece of corporate security hardware, and it was currently broadcasting a crystal-clear live audio feed of the entire interaction. On the other end of that encrypted connection sat my senior corporate attorney, recording every single syllable my father fabricated to the police. I tilted my head down just a fraction of an inch. I kept my eyes locked on Harrison as I spoke directly into my collar. My voice was little more than a controlled whisper, easily isolated by the microphone hardware. I informed my counsel that the hostile party had just escalated the situation by filing a fraudulent police report, claiming false imprisonment and a fabricated medical crisis. I instructed him to immediately contact the police dispatch captain on his direct line. I told my attorney to forward the digital security footage, the notarized trust documents, and the official medical clearance letter my pediatrician had provided just yesterday, confirming my perfect mental health. My father was actively trying to weaponize local law enforcement to break down my door, completely oblivious to the fact that my legal team was already intercepting the call to charge him with a federal crime. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open violently. 2 Seattle police officers entered the building with immediate tactical urgency. They were moving fast, their eyes scanning the marble foyer for the active threat they had been briefed on. Harrison immediately abandoned his position by the concierge desk and rushed toward them. He threw his hands up in a theatrical display of overwhelming relief, playing the role of the desperate savior to absolute perfection. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, ensuring the officers instantly identified me as the primary target. The officers did not hesitate. The emergency dispatch had primed them to expect a violent, unpredictable woman experiencing a severe psychological crisis with an infant trapped in immediate danger. They closed the distance between us with heavy, practiced steps, completely ignoring my brother, awkwardly holding cardboard boxes, and my sister-in-law crying into a smartphone nearby. The lead officer stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, deliberately invading my physical space to establish absolute authority. I watched his right hand drop down to his tactical belt, his fingers coming to rest heavily on the cold metal of his handcuffs. His partner mirrored the aggressive stance, resting his hand near his holster. The lead officer did not introduce himself, and he did not ask for my version of events. He used a sharp, commanding tone to demand that I immediately surrender the digital access key to my penthouse. He stated they were executing an emergency wellness check on the baby, and if I did not hand over the keys right now, they would bypass my consent and physically detain me to secure the perimeter. Over the broad shoulder of the police officer, I could see my father watching the scene unfold. Harrison stood there with his hands clasped together, his face masked in manufactured concern, eagerly waiting for the armed officers to forcefully extract the keys from my possession and hand him exactly what he wanted. The full physical weight of local law enforcement was now cornering me in my own building, actively demanding access to my sanctuary based entirely on a calculated lie. The trap was perfectly sprung, and the officers were seconds away from drawing their cuffs. I watched the subtle shift in my father's expression over the broad shoulder of the lead police officer. The theatrical mask of the panicked and desperate grandfather slipped just enough to reveal the calculated malice underneath. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across Harrison's face. He stood safely behind the armed officers, completely convinced that his aggressive manipulation had reached its flawless conclusion. He truly believed he had won. I thought he had successfully cornered me into an unwinnable position. In his mind, I was entirely out of options. I could either refuse the direct orders of local law enforcement, which would result in my immediate physical arrest, and grant him the perfect opportunity to seize control of my infant and my property while I sat in a holding cell. Or I could simply surrender the digital keys right now, handing him the absolute power he had always demanded. He assumed he had engineered a perfect checkmate, using the police as his personal enforcement division. I was so intoxicatingly arrogant, so completely blinded by his own perceived dominance, that he failed to notice the fundamental vulnerability in his attack. Harrison was operating entirely on the assumption that I was still the terrified daughter who would instantly collapse under the suffocating weight of his intimidation. He thought my rigid posture and my silence were symptoms of total panic. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for him to fully commit to his fraudulent narrative in front of armed federal and state witnesses. That arrogant smirk was not the look of a victor. It was the final, undeniable proof that a hostile liability had willingly stepped right into an inescapable legal trap. I did not break eye contact with my father as the officer unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. I just waited for the precise mathematical moment to execute the liquidation of his entire plan. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands defensively or attempt to physically resist the officers. Physical resistance is a biological response to fear, and I was not afraid. I simply looked the lead officer in the eye and informed him in a calm, completely flat tone that I was fully cooperating with his investigation. I politely instructed him to step toward the marble concierge desk so I could provide the exact documentation he required to assess the safety of the child. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly thrown off by my total lack of panic, but his training kicked in and he followed me to the counter. I unsealed the manila folder and placed it flat on the polished stone. I did not scramble or shake. I moved with the precise, deliberate speed of a corporate auditor presenting a final report. I pulled out the first document and slid it across the marble toward the officer. I told him he was looking at the notarized property deed and the articles of incorporation for the private limited liability company that officially owns the penthouse. I stated with absolute clarity that the man standing behind him, Harrison Sterling, possessed zero financial, legal, or physical authority over the unit. He was not a concerned landlord. He was a hostile trespasser attempting to leverage armed law enforcement to bypass private building security. Before the officer could fully process the property deed, I slid the second document directly next to the first. It was the printed confirmation receipt from the United States Postal Inspection Service. I explained that my brother and my sister-in-law, the two individuals currently standing near the revolving doors with cardboard boxes, were the subjects of an active federal mail fraud investigation. I informed the police that they had deliberately attempted to manufacture a fraudulent paper trail to claim legal tenancy, and their unannounced arrival with a loaded moving truck was the physical culmination of that documented crime. I watched the lead officer slowly remove his hand from his handcuffs. His aggressive, tactical posture began to dissolve into profound legal confusion. But I was not finished. Harrison had played his final card by attacking my sanity. He assumed that a claim of postpartum psychosis would be impossible for me to immediately disprove on a Friday afternoon. He had severely underestimated my risk mitigation protocols. I reached into the folder and produced the final piece of paper. It was a pristine, officially watermarked letter from a highly respected board-certified psychiatrist in Seattle. Knowing my father had a long history of utilizing medical gaslighting, whenever he lost control of a narrative, I had proactively scheduled a comprehensive psychological evaluation exactly 1 week ago. I pointed to the heavy black ink signature at the bottom of the page. I told the officers that the document was a complete medical clearance explicitly confirming that I possessed absolutely no signs of postpartum depression, psychosis, or any other mental health liability. I gathered the documents into a neat stack and looked directly into the eyes of the lead officer. I stated that the man who dialed emergency services had just committed a severe criminal offense by filing a false police report to facilitate an illegal home invasion. The two armed officers stared down at the undeniable, impenetrable wall of legal evidence resting on the counter. Then, in complete silence, they slowly turned their backs to me and locked their eyes directly onto my father. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted with the absolute precision of a dropping temperature. I watched the cognitive transition happen in real time as the legal gravity of my documents settled over the two officers. The lead officer slowly pushed the stack of papers back across the marble counter toward me. His physical posture transformed instantly. The aggressive tactical stance he had utilized to intimidate me completely vanished. He took a deliberate step backward, formally removing himself from my physical space and acknowledging that I presented zero liability. Pai and his partner turned their bodies in perfect unison, their focus completely detached from me and locked directly onto my father. The terrified grandfather routine that Harrison had so perfectly executed just minutes ago was now entirely useless. The officers were no longer looking at a concerned property owner or a desperate family member. They were staring down a suspect who had just actively manipulated them into responding to a fabricated crisis. They fully understood the severity of his actions. Utilizing the emergency dispatch system to file a fraudulent report and intentionally weaponize an armed police response is not a minor administrative infraction. It is a severe felony. The lead officer stared at Harrison with an expression of pure and unadulterated professional fury. He realized that my father had tried to use him and his partner as a personal battering ram. The silence in the cavernous lobby was absolute. The color rapidly drained from Harrison's face as the overwhelming reality of his miscalculation finally set in. He tried to take a step back, but his heavy boots seemed glued to the polished floor. The lead officer slowly lowered his right hand back down to his tactical belt. He did not unclip his handcuffs just yet, but his fingers rested heavily on the cold black metal. The power dynamic in the room had been completely inverted. My father had summoned the police to take my freedom, and now he had to watch them prepare to take his. The suffocating silence in the lobby was finally broken by the sound of a heavy cardboard box hitting the marble floor. I shifted my gaze past the police officers and looked toward the revolving doors. The sheer weight of the legal consequences had finally penetrated the profound arrogance of my brother and my sister-in-law. The absolute reality of federal mail fraud and illegal trespassing was now staring them directly in the face. Trent was standing completely frozen with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. The packing supplies he had been holding were scattered around his feet, and the color had entirely drained from his face. He lacked the capacity to process the sudden collapse of their plan. But it was Jasmine who completely shattered their fragile family alliance. She could read the highly aggressive posture of the police officers, and she instantly calculated that they were no longer walking into a free luxury penthouse. They were walking into a severe criminal indictment. Panic completely consumed her nervous system. She violently turned on my father, her voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous space. She screamed at Harrison with absolute desperation, instantaneously abandoning any remaining loyalty she had to the family patriarch. She shouted that he had explicitly promised them the legal paperwork for the apartment was already finalized. She cried out that he had guaranteed they simply needed to pack their belongings and move in today. She was loudly and publicly confessing that Harrison had orchestrated the entire fraudulent relocation. She was desperately trying to sever her own legal liability by throwing my father directly to the authorities. I stood perfectly still and observed the total internal collapse of their hostile operation. My father had manipulated Trent and Jasmine into acting as his physical placeholders, utilizing their endless greed for luxury housing to establish his fraudulent tenancy. He had convinced them that he possessed total dominance over my assets and my life. But the exact moment the threat of physical arrest materialized, his loyal soldiers instantly mutated into hostile witnesses. Jasmine continued to scream without taking a breath. Her voice cracked as she frantically accused Harrison of lying to them about the property deed and the trust fund. She was practically hyperventilating, completely unaware that she was inadvertently providing the armed police officers with a spontaneous and highly detailed verbal confession. She was perfectly corroborating every single piece of documented evidence I had just placed on the concierge desk. The two officers did not attempt to interrupt her frantic outburst. They simply stood there, their hands resting firmly on their tactical belts, listening as she aggressively dismantled my father's entire defense in front of multiple witnesses. The brilliant, unstoppable invasion strategy that Harrison had spent weeks engineering was currently burning to the ground, ignited entirely by the sheer panic of the people he had hired to execute it. I did not have to say another word. They were doing the absolute worst of the damage to themselves. I let Jasmine's frantic crying fade into the high ceilings of the lobby. I did not look at my brother or my sister-in-law. They were simply collateral damage in a much larger equation. My focus remained entirely locked on the man who had orchestrated this catastrophic failure. Harrison stared back at me, his face a mask of rapidly crumbling defiance. I took one single deliberate step forward. When I finally spoke, my voice was completely devoid of anger. It was perfectly measured and loud enough to carry across the entire marble foyer, reaching the police officers and the property manager with absolute clarity. I told my father that I found his sudden, overwhelming concern for my maternal well-being incredibly convenient. I stated that it was mathematically fascinating how his urgent desire to be a supportive grandfather happened to align perfectly with his catastrophic financial ruin back home. The two police officers immediately shifted their attention back to him, their professional suspicion deepening. I watched Harrison swallow hard as the reality of my intelligence gathering finally caught up to him. He had genuinely believed that geographical distance would insulate his failures from my auditing protocols. I did not lower my voice as I delivered the final, undeniable truth of his operation. I informed the entire lobby that they were not looking at a wealthy patriarch stepping in to rescue a vulnerable daughter. They were looking at a desperate, cornered man attempting a highly aggressive form of creditor evasion. I detailed the specific timeline of his financial collapse. I explained that his primary corporate accounts had been officially frozen by federal tax authorities exactly 72 hours ago. I stated for the official record that the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on his primary estate on Tuesday morning due to massive defaulting. I directed the attention of the police officers toward the glass doors where the loaded moving truck was illegally parked. I told them that the vehicle outside was not the result of a planned family relocation. It was a panicked, frantic midnight evacuation. Harrison had loaded his remaining unseized physical assets into a rented truck and driven across the country because he possessed absolutely zero liquid capital. He had targeted my secure corporate penthouse because he desperately needed a physical fortress to hide from his creditors. He fully intended to use my infant son as the ultimate emotional leverage to force his way inside and establish permanent free residency. I looked directly into my father's eyes and delivered the final assessment of his situation. I told him that he was entirely bankrupt. I told him that he was completely out of options. He had just committed a severe felony, attempting to steal my property, all to run from the consequences of his own gross financial mismanagement. His entire carefully constructed empire had collapsed into absolute nothingness, and I stated clearly that I would never allow him to use my home as a shield for his liabilities. I did not stop at his bankruptcy. A standard financial collapse is a localized liability, but my father had always been far too ambitious for standard failures. As a senior risk actuary, I do not simply look at frozen bank accounts. I audit the entire structural integrity of a portfolio. When I pulled the corporate filings for his primary real estate investment fund earlier this week, I was not looking for a proud grandfather. I was looking for a mathematical anomaly, and I found a massive one. I kept my voice perfectly level as I delivered the ultimate truth to the entire lobby. I stated that this unexpected family reunion had absolutely nothing to do with my newborn son. I looked at Trent, who was now physically shaking next to the revolving doors. I told the police officers that my father and my brother were not here to visit a grandchild or a nephew. They were here because they were actively fleeing federal jurisdiction. The silence in the room became absolutely suffocating. I explained that Harrison and Trent were the primary subjects of an active joint investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. They had not just mismanaged their corporate real estate fund, they had intentionally structured it as a massive Ponzi scheme. I detailed how they had spent the last 4 years actively committing aggressive wire fraud, siphoning millions of dollars from new investors to pay off the old ones. The fraudulent structure had completely collapsed on Monday morning. The federal agents had secured the sealed indictments, and my father knew the arrest warrants were imminent. He needed a highly secure luxury fortress with restricted access to bunker down and hide his remaining physical assets. He thought he could use my home and my child as the ultimate human shield against the federal government. I was not looking for family. He was looking for a non-extradition zone inside his own daughter's apartment. I looked at the lead police officer and stated clearly that by arresting my father for a fraudulent emergency report today, they would also be securing a highly valuable federal fugitive. The federal freeze on their accounts was absolute and immediate. They were completely locked out of the financial system in their home state, stripped of every digital asset they possessed. That is exactly why they drove across the country in the middle of the night to my doorstep. They desperately needed a pristine, debt-free property to serve as an untraceable safe house. I shifted my gaze to Trent, who was still awkwardly clutching one of the heavy reinforced cardboard boxes near the glass doors. I informed the police officers that my brother was most certainly not carrying baby clothes or household goods. I told them that if they opened those specific boxes right now, they would not find standard moving supplies. They would find rolled canvases of high-value fine art and tightly packed stacks of untraceable physical cash. They were actively attempting to smuggle their last remaining unseized assets across state lines to avoid federal confiscation. The entire operation was a highly calculated jurisdictional maneuver. By forcing their way into my penthouse and establishing sudden legal residency, Harrison intended to file for bankruptcy here in the state of Washington. He was frantically attempting to exploit local legal loopholes to shield his stolen wealth from the authorities back home, using my home as his personal financial fortress. And then I looked directly at Jasmine. She was still weeping openly, completely devastated by the total collapse of her luxury housing fantasy. I felt a brief clinical flash of pity for her. I stated clearly to the officers that my sister-in-law was not a master conspirator in this federal crime. She was nothing more than an operational decoy. Harrison and Trent had deliberately lied to her about the entire arrangement. They knew that two desperate men driving a rented truck full of cash would immediately attract law enforcement attention on the highway. They needed her physical presence to provide a facade of domestic normalcy. They needed a woman to make a frantic midnight escape look like a completely standard family relocation. They had weaponized her completely, using her as a human smokescreen to slip past the authorities. My father stared at me with hollow eyes. The realization that his entire financial sanctuary had been completely dismantled was finally sinking in. He thought my only line of defense was the local police department. He assumed that if he could just manipulate a few patrol officers, he would automatically win the war. But he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. A risk actuary does not simply react to an active threat. We anticipate the threat and we neutralize it before it ever reaches the front door. I had not just called my corporate attorney when I saw them on the security feeds. I had taken decisive offensive action entirely on my own. The exact moment my auditing algorithms flagged the massive financial irregularities in his real estate portfolio yesterday morning, I compiled a comprehensive digital dossier. I gathered every single forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every piece of documented evidence proving his Ponzi scheme. And then I anonymously routed that heavily encrypted data packet directly to the Seattle field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right on schedule. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open for a second time. The two local police officers immediately turned around, their hands still resting cautiously on their tactical belts. But the individuals entering the building were not local backup. They were two federal agents dressed in immaculately tailored dark suits, their official gold shields clipped visibly to their belts. They walked directly past my terrified brother and completely ignored my weeping sister-in-law. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose straight toward the center of the marble floor where my father was standing. I watched Harrison physically shrink into himself. The towering, aggressive patriarch who had demanded my absolute obedience just 15 minutes ago had completely evaporated. He was nothing more than a cornered fugitive staring directly at a federal indictment. He had traveled 2,000 miles across the country to hunt me down, completely oblivious to the fact that I had already designated him as the prey. The two federal agents did not even need to raise their voices. Their mere presence in the lobby completely neutralized any remaining resistance. One agent stepped directly in front of my father to officially take him into federal custody, while the second agent turned his attention toward the glass revolving doors. He exchanged a brief and highly professional nod with the local Seattle police officers, silently directing them toward the primary target parked illegally on the curb outside. I stood motionless and watched through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows as the local officers walked out into the cold night air. They approached the rented moving truck that my father had so desperately driven across the country. Trent had dropped the keys on the marble floor the exact moment the federal agents arrived, and one of the officers had smoothly collected them. I watched as the officer unlocked the heavy rear door of the truck, rolling it up just a few inches to visually confirm the cargo. Even from my position inside the lobby, I knew exactly what they were looking at. There were no baby cribs or changing tables inside that vehicle. The interior was packed tight with heavily reinforced shipping crates, vacuum-sealed bags of untraceable physical currency, and protective tubes containing millions of dollars in stolen fine art. It was the entire remaining liquidity of my father's fraudulent empire condensed into a single and highly vulnerable mobile storage unit. The officer immediately rolled the metal door back down to the bumper, securing the primary lock with a sharp, heavy click. He pulled a thick roll of bright red federal evidence tape from his utility belt and began sealing the metal latches, officially transforming the vehicle from a getaway car into a heavily guarded crime scene. He stretched the tamper-proof tape across the back doors, ensuring that no one could access the contents without triggering a federal tampering charge. Every single physical asset my father had desperately tried to siphon away from his victims was now legally frozen and secured for federal forfeiture. I watched the bright red tape reflect under the streetlights. The truck was no longer a physical threat to my sanctuary or my child. It was simply a locked box of material evidence, successfully neutralized, completely audited, and permanently removed from my balance sheet. The lead federal agent stepped directly into my father's personal space and calmly instructed him to place his hands behind his back. For a brief, highly irrational second, Harrison actually attempted to physically resist. It was a biological response born from an entire lifetime of never being told no. He tried to pull his arm away and began shouting frantically about his rights as a property owner and a grandfather. That single foolish movement was all the local police officers needed to escalate the situation from a standard detention to a forceful arrest. They moved in instantly. The lead officer grabbed his shoulder and firmly pinned his arm behind his heavy wool coat. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the quiet marble lobby was the most deeply satisfying sound I had ever heard. The officer loudly informed him that he was now officially under arrest for filing a felony false police report and actively resisting a peace officer. The federal agent stepped in and calmly added that he would also be held without bail in federal custody, pending a massive indictment for corporate wire fraud and financial conspiracy. Trent did not fight back. When the second officer approached him, my brother simply held out his trembling wrists, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the consequences. He was quickly handcuffed and read the exact same federal charges. The aggressive invasion force that had confidently marched into my building just 20 minutes ago had been completely dismantled. Within a matter of seconds, the two men who had driven across the country to steal my home and weaponize my newborn child were reduced to common criminals facing decades in a federal penitentiary. I stood completely motionless on the polished floor and watched as the officers marched them towards the revolving doors. Harrison looked back at me one final time over his shoulder as they pushed him toward the exit. His face was pale and entirely broken. He was desperately searching my eyes, perhaps expecting to see a terrified daughter grieving the sudden destruction of her family. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I offered no tears, no anger, and no parting words of closure. I simply watched him being escorted out into the cold Seattle night and loaded into the back of a police cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut, severing his connection to my life forever. The family dynasty he had built on manipulation and fraud was completely liquidated. I turned my back to the glass doors and walked toward the elevators, entirely satisfied that I had permanently removed the ultimate liability from my ledger. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside illuminated the polished marble floor of the lobby. With Harrison and Trent successfully removed from the premises, the absolute reality of the situation finally crashed down on the only hostile variable remaining. I turned my attention back to Jasmine. The perfectly curated, highly filtered facade of the wealthy influencer completely disintegrated right in front of me. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed heavily onto the cold stone floor, utterly destroyed by the sheer magnitude of the deception. The expensive smartphone she had been using to illegally broadcast my private residence slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the marble with a sharp crack, the screen fracturing into a spiderweb of broken glass as it skidded away. She did not even try to reach for it. Her glamorous aesthetic was entirely gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. She was sobbing uncontrollably, gasping for air, as she loudly processed the fact that her own husband and her father-in-law had manipulated her into acting as a federal accomplice. She realized she was never a valued member of their inner circle. She was nothing more than a highly disposable asset. They had used her social media presence and her desperate need for luxury to manufacture a convincing smokescreen for their criminal evacuation. I stood perfectly still, watching her weep on the floor. I felt no obligation to comfort her. Her emotional breakdown was the inevitable mathematical result of blindly trusting a fraudulent enterprise. I simply observed her collapse with the detached precision of an actuary finalizing a closed account. I did not smile. There was no sense of triumph or vindication to be found in this outcome. A successful audit does not require a dramatic celebration. It only requires a final signature. I calmly reached down to the polished reception desk and gathered the physical copies of the financial dossiers I had brought down with me. I aligned the edges of the heavy paper stock with precise movements, sliding the federal receipts and the property deeds back into my leather portfolio. The night manager was standing silently behind the concierge counter, his eyes wide as he processed the sudden emptiness of his lobby. I turned to him and offered a single highly professional nod to acknowledge his assistance in maintaining the perimeter of the building. I turned my back on the weeping woman on the floor and walked with measured steps toward the private residential elevators. I swiped my encrypted access card and stepped into the quiet mahogany-paneled cabin. I pressed the button for the penthouse level. As the heavy brass doors smoothly slid shut, they completely severed the visual feed of my collapsing family. The chaotic noise of the flashing police cruisers and the hysterical sobbing faded into absolute silence. The structural threat to my life was fully neutralized. The ultimate liability was permanently liquidated, the perimeter was completely secured, and I was finally returning upstairs to my newborn son. The penthouse was completely silent by the time I walked back through the heavy oak door. The chaotic variables of the outside world had been successfully isolated and permanently locked away. I walked softly into the nursery and lifted Miles from his crib. He was sleeping peacefully, entirely unaware of the massive structural collapse that had just occurred 50 floors below him. I held his warm weight securely against my chest and walked over to the massive glass windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. The city lights stretched out endlessly into the night, forming a perfect grid of predictable patterns and carefully calculated risks. People often make the fundamental mathematical error of treating family as a guaranteed fixed asset. They are socially conditioned to believe that shared genetics automatically equal an unconditional bond. But biological relation is simply a starting metric. It does not guarantee safety, and it certainly does not ensure loyalty. A toxic bloodline is the most dangerous liability a person can hold on their balance sheet, precisely because society expects you to endlessly absorb their catastrophic losses. I looked down at my son and listened to his quiet, steady breathing. I would never teach him to rely on the dangerous illusion of unconditional family loyalty. I will teach him that true security is never simply inherited. True safety must be actively managed, rigorously defended, and built on the absolute willingness to completely liquidate any active threat, regardless of what their last name happens to be. The ledger was finally clean, and our future was fully secured. Society is fundamentally programmed to condition women into becoming the ultimate peacekeepers. We are constantly expected to absorb the emotional and financial deficits of our relatives. We are told to willingly sacrifice our own internal stability just to maintain the fragile and unprofitable facade of a unified family. It is a terrible and deeply flawed investment strategy, one built entirely on the blind expectation of infinite female tolerance. But my father and my brother made a catastrophic miscalculation when they attempted to apply that outdated social metric to my life. They looked at a new mother and assumed they had found a compliant human shield. They expected me to simply default to a traditional biological role and quietly absorb their massive criminal liabilities. But they failed to realize that when a family attempts to utilize you as a designated tool for risk disposal, they are actively handing over the keys to their own ruin. I did not need to shout. I did not need to throw a chaotic emotional tantrum in the middle of a luxury lobby. I simply stepped back, gathered the data, and allowed the federal audit to run its natural course. They thought they could rely on my passive compliance to save their fraudulent empire. They did not understand that my absolute silence was not an act of surrender. My silence was the precise and highly calculated weapon that guaranteed their total destruction. True power is never found in the middle of a screaming match inside a marble lobby. It is not a chaotic theatrical display, and it is certainly not about desperately demanding respect from people who fundamentally view you as a disposable asset. Those are the frantic actions of individuals who have entirely lost control of their own environment. True power is cold, precise, and completely silent. It is the simple, highly calculated act of changing the locks. It is the absolute discipline required to stand perfectly still behind a reinforced door, observing the situation with total detachment and watching quietly as they confidently march forward, ultimately locking themselves inside the exact same trap they spent their entire lives trying to set for you.